They said the wolves obeyed no one living except the king. That was the law of the keep, older than its stones. The 7 great war wolves of the Var line answered one voice, one hand, one scent, and every soldier who had tried to learn otherwise carried the scars of that lesson somewhere on his body and was quiet about it. The wolves were not beasts in the ordinary sense. They were something older, something the pack historians called the Var's living seals, bred across a dozen generations to carry the blood mark of the ruling line and trained to recognize its authority through bone and instinct rather than command or reward. They had not chosen freely in 11 years. Since the old Luna died in the year of the Great Fire, they had answered commands because they were trained to, and they had answered Calder's commands with the particular precision of animals performing a duty they understand but no longer feel, and the keep had learned to live with the difference without naming it. So when a thin woman in a scribe's gray mantle stepped into the training yard on a frost-locked morning, carrying a ledger and an ink case, and nothing else, and all 7 wolves rose from their positions and crossed the packed earth toward her, with their heads low and their amber eyes fixed on her face, and sat at her feet in a ring, and the guards watching forgot how to move. They stood in the cold with their command rods loose in their hands and stared at a woman who had not yet looked up from her ledger, and they understood without being told that the thing they were seeing was not a behavior and not a mistake, and not a training failure. It was a recognition. By nightfall, the whole keep would know. By morning, the Alpha King would be forced to decide what it meant. He would stand at the top of the training yard steps with his second at his shoulder and his jaw locked and his eyes very still. And every instinct he had buried under 11 years of governance would push against the inside of his ribs, and he would call it a threat because he did not yet have the language for what it actually was. What he did not know, and what she did not know, and what only the wolves had understood from the first moment her shadow fell across the cold yard, was that the line was not broken. It had been sleeping. It was awake now. The year was the 943rd by the old reckoning, and the cold turning had come 6 days early. Snow had settled on the outer battlements of Vargast Keep before the solstice fires had fully burned down, and the river below the cliff road was locked to a gray silence that would hold until the thaw moon in late winter. Mira had arrived with the last supply cart before the passes closed, sitting atop a crate of wax tablets with her ankles crossed and her ledger open on her knee, reading, because there was nothing else to do on a 3-day road, and she had learned to make use of the time she was given. She was 23 years old, recently assigned by the Hall of Records to fill the keep's vacant scribe position, the previous scribe having died of a lung sickness in the autumn. She had not asked to come to Vargast. She had been given no choice, which was more or less the condition of her employment since her father's seal had been struck from the family register 6 years before. The council's ruling had been brief. Aldrich the record-keeper had falsified lineage rolls on behalf of a disgraced noble house, had been stripped of standing, and the family's contracts and assignments would pass to the hall's direct administration pending review. The review had never concluded. Mira had been 17 when she understood that it would never conclude, and 20 when she had gathered evidence sufficient to be certain her father had falsified nothing, and 23 when she arrived at Vargast Keep with ink stains on her fingers and a very small trunk, and the sealed appointment letter that constituted the entirety of her authority in this place. She did not know about the wolves. The supply master who unloaded the cart told her where the record room was and nothing else, and she found it on the 3rd floor of the inner keep. A long room with 3 windows and shelves that had not been organized by anyone with a coherent system in at least 4 years. And she set down her trunk and opened the nearest window to let the cold air in, and began cataloging the disorder. That was the first day. On the second day, she crossed the inner yard with a stack of old requisition rolls under her arm and the wind off the battlements driving sleet into her face, and she heard behind her the sound of something large and certain moving toward her across packed earth, and she turned. 7 wolves, each of them built to the shoulder height of a war destrier. Each dark-coated and collar-fitted with the heavy iron rings of the Var war line, were walking toward her across the frozen ground. Not running, walking, deliberate and low-headed, with their amber eyes fixed on her face and not on the rolls she was holding, or the cloak she was wearing, or the space behind her, but on her face, specifically, as if she were a landmark they had been navigating toward for a long time. She did not run. She stood still and held the requisition rolls against her chest and watched them come. And the cold air in the yard seemed to thin and concentrate, and she could hear her own pulse quite clearly. When the nearest wolf, the black-furred one with the long scar across its left shoulder, reached her and sat down in the snow 2 feet from her boots and looked up at her, she exhaled. A long, involuntary exhalation, as if she had been holding breath she had not known she was holding. She looked at the wolf for a long moment. The wolf looked at her. Its eyes were warm and lucid and absolutely steady, and the thing in them was not a threat and was not hunger. She said, quietly and to no one in particular, "Hello." The other 6 arranged themselves in a loose ring and sat as well. In the training yard across the inner wall, the head trainer Voss stood with his command rod hanging at his side and his face the color of old ash. Voss reported the incident to Bren before the training session had formally ended, and by that evening Mira had been informed that her duties would now include attending the morning training sessions to observe the wolves' command responses. She accepted this addition without comment and went back to the requisition rolls. She was working through the 3rd drawer when Tilda found her. The records custodian was a compact older woman with a gray braid wound twice around the back of her head and ink stains that had worked their way permanently into the creases of her knuckles, and she moved through the keep with the unhurried authority of someone who had outlasted 4 heads of staff and expected to outlast a 5th. She set a cup of heated broth on the desk beside Mira without asking whether it was wanted, and settled herself on the window ledge, and regarded Mira with the expression of a person performing a careful appraisal. "You touched Ash's collar this morning," she said, "the scar-shouldered one, before the session started." "He had a burr lodged in the fitting," Mira said. "It was pressing into the skin on his neck." "Night iron fitting," Tilda said. "You know what night iron does to someone who carries wolf blood that hasn't been sealed and registered." Mira knew. She had read about it in 3 separate histories, and a secondary account that described a case in the northern reaches 40 years prior. Night iron reacted to unsettled or unclaimed wolf lineage the way heat reacted to dry tinder. It burned through the skin immediately, left a mark that did not heal cleanly, and would keep burning on contact with the person until the iron was removed. It was used in the collars not as cruelty, but as a specific protection against unauthorized claiming, because a wolf-blooded person who was not the rightful keeper could, in theory, establish a bond by sustained contact, and the night iron prevented that. "I'm a scribe," Mira said. Tilda looked at her hands, which were unmarked. "Yes," Tilda said. She took her cup and left. Mira sat alone in the record room for a long time after that, looking at her own hands on the desk in front of her, thinking about the way the collar fitting had been cool and quiet against her fingers, thinking about the way Ash had pressed the whole weight of his head into her shoulder as she worked, slow and steady, like something coming to rest. She had not thought about her father's lineage in 3 years. She had not let herself. The evidence she had gathered at 20, and then set aside because setting it aside was the only way to keep functioning in a world that had arranged itself against her. The secondary notation she had found in a copy of the old rolls, the mismatched ink weights, the 2 witnesses who had since left the city for postings that had arrived with suspicious timing, all of it had been folded into a small interior drawer and left there. She had become a very good scribe because being a very good scribe was the only form of authority she had access to, and she intended to use what she had. But she had not let herself look at what she might be, beyond that. She looked at her hands now, and then she looked away and picked up her pen. If you find yourself wondering where this is going, so did she. She pushed the thought aside and returned to the requisition rolls, and the lamp burned lower, and outside the snow came on again in the dark. The mornings in the training yard established a pattern that Mira did not expect, and Voss did not conceal his distress about. She arrived with her observation ledger and took her position on the low stone wall at the yard's eastern edge, and the wolves, regardless of where they had been positioned at dawn, located her within the first few minutes and arranged themselves near her. Not crowding her, not demanding anything, simply near. Ash was always closest, lying at the wall's base with his long chin on his forepaws and one amber eye monitoring the yard. The other 6 disposed themselves in a rough half-circle that placed Mira within the ring and Voss's training exercises outside it. Voss ran the standard command sequences and the wolves performed them with their bodies while their attention remained elsewhere, and the observation ledger filled up with Mira's precise notes, and Voss's face grew incrementally tighter across each session. She noted the behavioral patterns without editorializing, which was her training, and she noted her own responses to the wolves with the same flat precision, which was harder. She had not expected to like them. She had expected large, dangerous, trained animals with an appetite for compliance and no interest in her beyond the novelty of something new in their environment. What she found instead was a quality in Ash in particular that she could only describe as attentiveness, a sense that when he looked at her, he was not looking at a stranger. On the third morning, she brought a second piece of bread in her coat pocket, not having planned to, and when the session broke, she sat on the wall and broke it and held out half to Ash, and he took it from her fingers with a gentleness that seemed calibrated to her, delicate and deliberate, and something in her chest did a thing she could not name and did not try to. She wrote in the observation ledger, "Subject Ash demonstrates consistent orientation to observer's position." She did not write what the orientation felt like from the inside. On the 4th morning she arrived early, before Voss, because the record room had been cold and she had given up on sleep at the 5th bell. The yard was empty and dark at that hour, lit only by the torch brackets at the gate, and she sat on the low wall with her cloak pulled close, and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and watched the first gray begin to come into the sky above the battlements. Ash found her within 10 minutes. He came across the empty yard alone, unhurried, and lay down beside the wall and pressed his warm flank against the cold stone near her boot, and they sat together in the dark and the quiet while the keep woke around them. She had not felt, in 6 years, anything that she would have called safe. She was careful not to name the feeling now. She looked at the gray sky and felt the warmth of the wolf through the stone beside her foot, and held the feeling without putting language to it, because language made things fragile, and she could not afford for this to be fragile. When Voss arrived 20 minutes later and found her already in position with Ash at the wall's base, his face did a sequence of movements that told her everything she needed to know about the trajectory of the next several days. It was on the 5th morning that the king came to watch. She had not expected him. She had been in Vargast Keep 11 days and had seen Calder twice at a distance, once crossing the Great Hall, and once on the outer wall in the early morning when she had been at the record room window taking air, and both times she had noted him the way she noted everything that was relevant to the keep's structure: rank, function, bearing, approximate disposition. He was tall and broad, dark of hair and eye, and wore authority the way certain objects hold weight, not loudly but with an absolute resistance to being moved. He had not spoken to her, and she had not expected him to. Senior scribes did not require royal acknowledgement to perform their work. She was transcribing a stack of trade agreements when she heard the change in the yard below, the particular quality of attention that a space acquires when something of consequence enters it, and she looked up from the window and saw him at the top of the training steps with Bren at his shoulder. She looked for a moment and then returned to the trade agreements, which was the correct professional response. In the yard below, she heard Voss call the command sequence. She heard the wolves not respond to it. She heard the silence that followed, which was a specific kind of silence, weighted and asymmetric. She picked up her pen. She did not go to the window. She heard Voss try the override signal, 3 sharp syllables in the old tongue, and she heard the silence that answered it. And then she heard, very clearly through the stone and the cold air, the particular stillness of a man standing absolutely still for a long time, and then the sound of boots on the steps going back inside. Bren came to the record room that afternoon. "The king will want a full transcription of the Var lineage rolls," he said, with the specific courtesy of a man conveying a priority, not a request. "The originals, not the archive copies. Tomorrow morning, if the work permits." She said the work would permit it. She brought the original Var rolls to the War Council chamber the next morning and settled at the far end of the long stone table with her writing kit, while Calder worked at the head of it. And the room was large enough that the distance between them should have made the session unremarkable. It did not feel unremarkable. She was aware of him the way she was aware of a hearth in a cold room, not looking at it directly, but always knowing precisely where the heat was and how far she was from it. He read his reports, and she transcribed the rolls, and an hour passed, and then another, and she was into the 3rd generation of the Var secondary branches when he spoke without looking up from his work. "There's a double clan notation in the 47th entry, a secondary acknowledgement. What does the mark indicate?" She answered him without looking up, citing the notation convention by its year of codification and the council decision that had established it. The secondary acknowledgement mark indicated a lineage intersection that the primary clan had recognized but not fully absorbed, a branch that had been acknowledged as belonging to the bloodline without being formally elevated within the hierarchy. He was quiet for a moment after her answer. "You were trained in the original notation systems," he said, "not the current simplified forms." "My father trained me," she said. "He kept the original systems in active use." There was a beat. She kept her eyes on the rolls. "His name?" "Aldrich," she said, "of the Hall of Records, stripped 6 years ago." She did not look up when she said it. She heard him set down his report. He did not ask further. She turned a page and kept working, and the silence that followed was different from the silence before, one that had a texture to it, a quality of weight shifting. 20 minutes passed in that silence. She reached the 6th generation of the secondary branch, where the notation grew dense with acknowledgement marks and lateral indicators, and she was moving carefully through the fine script when she heard him stand. He crossed the room, not toward the door but toward the window, and stood there looking out at the gray courtyard below, and she was acutely aware of the change in the room's geometry. The distance between them halved, the warmth of another body perceptible now through the cold stone air. The Var secondary line was registered at the secondary acknowledgement level in the 44th year, she said, because it was relevant to the notation she was transcribing, and because saying it out loud was easier than sitting in the altered silence. It was annotated as pending full elevation, pending a lineage review that appears never to have concluded. "No," he said, quietly and toward the window. "It never concluded." She kept writing. She did not ask why. She was very good at not asking questions she could answer herself if she thought about it long enough. And she was thinking about it, and the shape of the answer was taking form in the back of her mind in a way she was not yet ready to look at directly. When she left an hour later with her transcription kit under her arm, she was 3 steps into the corridor before she heard his chair move. She did not turn. She heard the footsteps reach the doorway and stop, And she walked on through the cold hall, and the warmth at the back of her neck where his attention had landed did not diminish until she was back in the record room with the door closed, and Ash stretched across the threshold like a warm draft blocker, watching her with amber eyes that held, she had come to believe, a quantity of patience that was entirely unnatural. 2 days later, Voss went to the council. The charge was wolf-binding sorcery, which under the Vargast Compact was addressed as a capital offense. The deliberate suppression of a war-wolf's command responses through a forbidden claim method was considered an act of political sabotage, because the wolves were the keep's first defense and their compromise was the keep's compromise. Voss laid his statement before the 3 senior council members in the small council room off the Great Hall, and his evidence was organized with a precision that Mira, when she later heard it described, could not help but notice was more careful than anything else the man had ever produced in his capacity as head trainer. He had 2 soldiers who would testify to having observed her murmuring to Ash after the second session. He had a gate warden who would attest to having seen a light around her hands when she first handled the collar in the yard. He had a written record, signed and sealed, of the specific command failures that had begun on the day of her arrival. He was careful not to mention the night iron. He was careful not to explain what the night iron would have demonstrated. Mira learned of it from Tilda, who appeared at the record room door an hour after the council session broke, and told her plainly, because Tilda believed that the space between knowing a thing and being told it was wasted time. Mira listened. She sat with the information for a moment and then said, "The gate warden. Does he owe Voss anything?" Tilda said the gate warden owed Voss a debt from the autumn gaming tables, recorded in the guard barracks ledger, which she had noted 3 weeks ago when she processed the barracks accounts. "I'll need that entry," Mira said. "I'll bring it," Tilda said. She paused at the door. "There's another matter." She crossed back to the desk and set down a folded paper that Mira recognized as an archival notation form, old stock, the kind used for secondary registrations. "I found it in the 4th-generation files 2 weeks ago. I didn't know what to do with it." Mira opened it. The notation inside was in her father's hand, the careful double-stroked letters she had grown up watching him form, and what it recorded was a secondary registration that had been submitted to the Hall of Records 23 years before and marked received but never entered into the main rolls. She looked at it for a long time. Tilda left without speaking further, which was the right thing to do. Mira set the paper on the table beside her father's seal entry in the current rolls and looked at them together. The request and the suppression, 23 years of silence condensed into 2 pages, and she understood the shape of what Suna had been protecting and what he had been willing to destroy to keep it protected. Her father had found the suppressed entry. He had submitted the correction. And someone had ensured that the correction was buried, and then that the man who submitted it was stripped of his standing before he could try again. Her father had sat in a hearing room 6 years ago with a fabricated case in front of him and 2 bought witnesses, and no time to produce a counter. She had been 17 and furious and helpless. She was 23 now, and the containment order came within the hour, and she was not furious. She was very, very clear. She could not see Ash from inside the cell, but she could hear him in the corridor, the slow, particular breathing of an animal that has settled in for a long wait. After a time, her eyes adjusted, and she could make out the dark mass of his shoulder through the bars. All 7 wolves were there. The guards who tried to move them reported back that no command had produced a response, including the king's formal override signal. The wolves heard it, turned their heads toward the speaker, and looked back at the cell door and did not move. The cell was cold in the particular way of underground stone that holds the season's chill without relief, and she pulled her cloak closer and sat on the stone shelf and ran through what she had. The hearing was at dawn. She had a counter-demonstration that would collapse the charge. Bare-handed contact with the night iron, no burn mark witnessed. The problem was access. The collar fittings were on the wolves in the corridor, behind bars she could not open from her side. She thought about this for a while. Then she moved to the bars and reached her arm through the gap, angling her shoulder until her fingers found the edge of the corridor floor, and she waited. Ash moved. It took him a minute to adjust his position in the narrow space, and she heard the heavy shift of his body and felt the warmth of his breath against her fingers before his collar came within reach. The warmth of him in the cold corridor was remarkable, a living heat she had not realized she had been missing until it met her outstretched hand. She found the side fitting by feel, a flat disc of night iron the size of a large coin, fitted to a ring at the collar's lateral point. She worked the pin loose carefully. The night iron was cool and quiet under her hands, absolutely indifferent to her touch. And Ash held himself very still while she worked, as if he understood exactly what she needed and was providing it. The pin gave. She drew the disc back through the bars and held it in her palm in the torchlight, and looked at it and looked at her hand. And she heard a footstep in the corridor that was not a guard's. Calder stood 10 feet away. He was alone. He was looking at her hand, at the night iron disc resting in her unmarked palm, and his face had gone very still in the specific way a face goes still when a thing that has been suspected for a long time is suddenly confirmed in front of witnesses who did not exist a moment ago. Ash turned his head toward the king. The amber eyes held something that Mira could only describe later as patient recognition, as though the wolf had been waiting for precisely this moment, for the king to come to the corridor and see what the wolves had always known. What happened in the next hour she would reconstruct later from what Bren told her and what she heard through stone. Calder went directly to the barracks and woke the soldier who had been listed as the first witness. He did not raise his voice, by all accounts, which was the detail that made the soldier confess within minutes, that particular quality of a man asking a question when he already holds the answer and is deciding what to do with the person who gives the wrong one. The soldier gave the right one. The gate warden, reached next, needed rather less persuasion once informed that the barracks ledger debt was in Bren's possession. Voss, confronted last, did not confess to anything, but his silence in front of the two recanting witnesses was sufficient. When the cell door opened, it was Bren with the key, and two senior soldiers behind him, and behind them the sound of the great hall filling with people, because Calder had called a full assembly, which had not happened in Vargast Keep in 11 years, not since the old Luna died, and the wolves had last chosen freely, and the keep had quietly arranged itself around the loss, without ever saying what it had lost. She walked out of the cell and through the corridor and up the long stairs with Ash at her left shoulder, and the other 6 wolves ranged behind her, and the hall was packed to its walls with soldiers and servants and council members and the foreign trade delegation that had been resident at the keep for the solstice negotiations, and every one of them turned when she entered. The silence had the quality of a breath held. Calder stood at the head of the hall in front of the dais, not on it. He had removed the iron circlet and held it at his side. His face was the face of a man who has been waiting 11 years to say something and has at last been handed the occasion. Elder Suna stood near the council table with his eyes on the stone floor. His face was the color of old candle wax, and the calculation that had sustained him for 23 years of suppressed records and arranged accusations had run out. And what was left underneath it was not courage. Calder spoke, and what he said carried in the cold hall without effort, because the hall was absolutely still, and he spoke each word as if it had weight, and he intended it to land. He said that Aldrich of the Hall of Records had been falsely accused 6 years prior on the instruction of Elder Soon, to prevent the formal acknowledgement of a secondary Var lineage that Soon had suppressed from the rolls 23 years before. He said the lineage was standing before the assembly. He said it had demonstrated blood right to the night iron, and he held up the disc she had removed from Ash's collar, and he held up, beside it, her father's seal, which he had retrieved from the council's locked archive while Bren was opening her cell. He walked toward her and held out the seal. The hall did not breathe. She looked at it for a moment that felt longer than it was. The worn iron disc with the old notch mark in the lower rim. The mark she had last seen her father wearing when she was 16, and the world had still made a particular kind of sense. She took it. His hand closed over hers for a moment before releasing it, warm and certain, and the contact went through her like a struck bell, a resonance that had nothing to do with the seal and everything to do with the man holding it, and she steadied herself and held the seal against her chest and looked up at him. "You have always been the keeper of this line," he said. He said it for her, though the hall was quiet enough to carry it, and she held his gaze for one full breath and did not look away. Then he turned to face the assembly, and he went to one knee on the cold stone floor, and the silence lasted one heartbeat. And then Bren went to one knee, and the two soldiers behind him. And then the motion moved through the hall the way a tide moves, steadily and without hurry, each person following the person beside them, until 300 people were kneeling on the flagstones of the great hall of Vargast Keep, and Mira stood among them with her father's seal in her hand, and the wolves at her back, and the torchlight catching the gold thread of the old emblem, and she did not say anything at all, because the hall had already said it, and the stone had said it, and Ash, settling the full warm weight of his head against her hip with the particular ease of an animal finally at rest, had been saying it since the second morning when he first crossed the frozen yard to sit at her feet. Voss was stripped of his rank before the assembly broke and taken to the barracks under guard pending a full review. Elder Suna was confined to his chambers. 3 separate council members requested permission to review his correspondence with the old trade houses, and Calder granted all 3 requests before the hall had fully cleared. Mira watched the assembly dissolve from her place near the dais with the wolves around her, and felt the specific quality of tiredness that comes not from exertion, but from the end of a long tension, as if a mechanism she had been holding together for years with the force of her attention had finally been transferred to something sturdy enough to hold itself. Tilda appeared at her elbow with a cup of heated broth and said, "Come." And Mira went. And the wolves came too. And that was how she ended up back in the record room, with a lamp lit and the VAR lineage rolls open on the table. Because work was the shape she gave to the hours when she did not know what else to do with herself. She found the suppressed notation in the 23rd year entries before the second hour. It had not been removed, but overwritten. A second notation in a different hand layered over the original in ink of a slightly different composition. The kind of thing that would pass casual examination and would not survive the attention of someone who had spent 6 years looking for exactly this kind of mark. She copied it in full, with the correction noted in the margin and dated, and she added a cross-reference to the secondary evidence in the barracks ledger, and she signed it, and pressed her father's seal into the wax at the foot of the page. Tilda sat on the window ledge through the second and third hours and said nothing useful, which was useful in its own way. Ash lay across the doorway. The other 6 wolves arranged themselves in the corridor with the air of animals who had finished a long task and were content to wait out what came next. Calder came to the door near the 3rd hour. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and looked at what she was doing for a moment, and then he said quietly, "Your father. Does he still hold his room in the archive district?" "He does," she said. "I'll send for him at first light," he said. "If that is what you want." She said it was. He looked at the corrected record and the seal in the margin, and his face did something that was not entirely composed, a brief, unguarded movement across the features of a man who has been composed for 11 years and is no longer certain why. She did not make it smaller by naming it. She picked up her pen and kept writing, and after a moment she heard him move, not away, but toward the window chair. And he sat, and the lamp burned between them, and the silence was the first silence in Vargast Keep that had felt to her like shelter rather than pressure, A person choosing to be in the same room not because duty required it, but because the room held something worth remaining near. She wrote. He sat. The lamp declined. At some point between the third hour and the fourth, she looked up, and he was asleep in the chair with his chin against his chest, and the iron circlet set aside on the table's corner. And Ash had lifted his great head from the doorway to observe this, and then settled it back, with the expression of a thing entirely satisfied with the arrangement of the world. She let him sleep. She finished the corrected record and closed the ledger and pressed her hands flat against the worn cover for a moment, feeling the familiar resistance of good binding, the small indent left by the old lock clasp. Through the window, the sky was moving toward the gray that precedes first light, and the snow was coming again, soft and steady, filling in the prints that the wolves had left across the yard. The lamp was nearly out. Tilda's cup sat empty at the desk edge. The wolves breathed slow in the corridor. Mira, daughter of Aldrich, keeper of the Var line, sat in the record room of Vargast Keep and looked at the man asleep in the window chair, and at the seal resting beside her pen, and at the old rolls corrected in her own hand at last, and she let herself feel, quietly and without ceremony, the particular grace of a morning that could begin clean.